John Winston Ono Lennon, born John Winston Lennon, was an English singer, songwriter, musician, and peace activist who achieved worldwide fame as founder, co-songwriter, co-lead vocalist, and rhythm guitarist of the Beatles. Lennon's work was characterized by the rebellious nature and acerbic wit of his music, writing, and drawings, on film, and in interviews. His songwriting partnership with Paul McCartney remains the most successful in history. Born in Liverpool, Lennon became involved in the skiffle craze as a teenager. In 1956, he formed the Quarrymen, which evolved into the Beatles in 1960. Sometimes called the Smart Beatle, he was initially the group's de facto leader, a role gradually ceded to McCartney. Through his songwriting in the Beatles, Lennon embraced a myriad of musical influences, initially writing and co-writing rock and pop-oriented hit songs in the band's early years, then later incorporating experimental elements into his compositions in the latter half of the Beatles' career as his songs became known for their increasing innovation. Lennon soon expanded his work into other media by participating in numerous films, including How I Won the War, and authoring in his own right, and A Spaniard in the Works, both collections of nonsense writings and line drawings. Starting with All You Need Is Love, his songs were adopted as anthems by the anti-war movement and the larger counterculture of the 1960s. In 1969, he started the Plastic Ono Band with his second wife, the multimedia artist Yoko Ono, held a 2-week-long anti-war demonstration Bed-Ins for Peace, and left the Beatles to embark on a solo career. Between 1968 and 1972, Lennon and Ono collaborated on many works, including a trilogy of avant-garde albums, several more films, his solo debut John Lennon/Plastic Ono Band, and the international top 10 singles Give Peace a Chance, Instant Karma, Imagine, and Happy Christmas, War Is Over. Moving to New York City in 1971, his criticism of the Vietnam War resulted in a 3-year deportation attempt by the Nixon administration. Lennon and Ono separated from 1973 to 1975, during which time he produced Harry Nilsson's album Pussycats. He also had chart-topping collaborations with Elton John, Whatever Gets You Through the Night, and David Bowie, Fame. Following a 5-year hiatus, Lennon returned to music in 1980 with the Ono collaboration Double Fantasy. He was murdered by a Beatles fan, Mark David Chapman, 3 weeks after the album's release. As a performer, writer or co-writer, Lennon had 25 #1 singles in the Billboard Hot 100 chart. Double Fantasy, his best-selling album, won the 1981 Grammy Award for Album of the Year. In 1982, Lennon won the Brit Award for Outstanding Contribution to Music. In 2002, Lennon was voted 8th in a BBC History poll of the 100 Greatest Britons. Rolling Stone ranked him the 5th greatest singer and 38th greatest artist of all time. He was inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame in 1997, and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice, as a member of the Beatles in 1988, and as a solo artist in 1994. Lennon was born on October 9, 1940 at Liverpool Maternity Hospital to Julia, née Stanley, 1914 to 1958, and Alfred Lennon, 1912 to 1976. Alfred was a merchant seaman of Irish descent who was away at the time of his son's birth. His parents named him John Winston Lennon after his maternal grandfather, John Jack Lennon, and Prime Minister Winston Churchill. His father was often away from home but sent regular paychecks to 9 Newcastle Road, Liverpool, where Lennon lived with his mother. The checks stopped when he went absent without leave in February 1944. When he eventually came home 6 months later, he offered to look after the family, but Julia, by then pregnant with another man's child, rejected the idea. After her sister Mimi complained to Liverpool's social services twice, Julia gave her custody of Lennon. In July 1946, Lennon's father visited her, and took his son to Blackpool, secretly intending to emigrate to New Zealand with him. Julia followed them, with her partner at the time, Bobby Dykins, and after a heated argument, his father forced the 5-year-old to choose between them. In one account of this incident, Lennon twice chose his father, but as his mother walked away, he began to cry, and followed her. According to author Mark Lewison, however, Lennon's parents agreed that Julia should take him, and give him a home. Billy Hall, who witnessed the incident, has said that the dramatic portrayal of a young John Lennon being forced to make a decision between his parents is inaccurate. Lennon had no further contact with Alf for close to 20 years. Throughout the rest of his childhood and adolescence, Lennon lived at Mendips, 251 Menlove Avenue, Woolton, with Mimi and her husband George Toogood Smith, who had no children of their own. His aunt purchased volumes of short stories for him, and his uncle, a dairyman at his family's farm, bought him a mouth organ, and engaged him in solving crossword puzzles. Julia visited Mendips on a regular basis, and John often visited her at 1 Blomfield Road, Liverpool, where she played him Elvis Presley records, taught him the banjo, and showed him how to play Ain't That a Shame by Fats Domino. In September 1980, Lennon commented about his family, and his rebellious nature. "A part of me would like to be accepted by all facets of society, and not be this loud-mouthed lunatic poet/musician. But I cannot be what I am not. I was the one who all the other boys' parents, including Paul's father, would say, 'Keep away from him.' The parents instinctively recognized I was a troublemaker, meaning I did not conform, and I would influence their children, which I did. I did my best to disrupt every friend's home. Partly out of envy that I didn't have this so-called home. But I did. There were 5 women that were my family. 5 strong, intelligent, beautiful women, 5 sisters. One happened to be my mother. She just couldn't deal with life. She was the youngest, and she had a husband who ran away to sea, and the war was on, and she couldn't cope with me, and I ended up living with her elder sister. Now those women were fantastic. And that was my first feminist education. I would infiltrate the other boys' minds. I could say, parents are not gods because I don't live with mine, and, therefore, I know." He regularly visited his cousin Stanley Parks, who lived in Fleetwood, and took him on trips to local cinemas. During the school holidays, Parks often visited Lennon with Layla Harvey, another cousin, and the 3 often traveled to Blackpool 2 or 3 times a week to watch shows. They would visit the Blackpool Tower Circus, and see artists such as Dickie Valentine, Arthur Askey, Max Bygraves, and Joe Laws, with Parks recalling that Lennon particularly liked George Formby. After Parks's family moved to Scotland, the 3 cousins often spent their school holidays together there. Parks recalled, "John, cousin Layla, and I were very close. From Edinburgh we would drive up to the family croft at Durness, which was from about the time John was 9 years old until he was about 16. Lennon's uncle George died of a liver hemorrhage on June 5, 1955, aged 52. Lennon was raised as an Anglican, and attended Dovedale Primary School. After passing his 11+ exam, he attended Quarry Bank High School in Liverpool from September 1952 to 1957, and was described by Harvey at the time as a happy-go-lucky, good-humoured, easygoing, lively lad. He also established a reputation as the class clown. He often drew comical cartoons that appeared in his own, self-made school magazine called The Daily Howl. In 1956, Julia bought John his first guitar. The instrument was an inexpensive Gallatin Champion acoustic for which she lent her son £5 and 10 shillings on the condition that the guitar be delivered to her own house, and not Mimi's, knowing well that her sister was not supportive of her son's musical aspirations. Mimi was skeptical of his claim that he would be famous one day, and she hoped that he would grow bored with music, often telling him, "The guitar's all very well, John, but you'll never make a living out of it." On July 15, 1958, Julia Lennon was struck and killed by a car while she was walking home after visiting the Smiths' house. His mother's death traumatized the teenage Lennon, who, for the next 2 years, drank heavily, and frequently got into fights, consumed by a blind rage. Julia's memory would later serve as a major creative inspiration for Lennon, inspiring songs such as the 1968 Beatles song Julia. Lennon's senior school years were marked by a shift in his behavior. Teachers at Quarry Bank High School described him thus: "He has too many wrong ambitions, and his energy is often misplaced, and his work always lacks effort. He is content to drift instead of using his abilities." Lennon's misbehavior created a rift in his relationship with his aunt. Lennon failed his O-level examinations, and was accepted into the Liverpool College of Art after his aunt and headmaster intervened. At the college he began to wear teddy boy clothes, and was threatened with expulsion for his behavior. In the description of Cynthia Powell, Lennon's fellow student, and subsequently his wife, he was thrown out of the college before his final year. At the age of 15, Lennon formed a skiffle group, the Quarrymen. Named after Quarry Bank High School, the group was established by Lennon in September 1956. By the summer of 1957, the Quarrymen played a spirited set of songs made up of half skiffle, and half rock and roll. Lennon first met Paul McCartney at the Quarrymen's second performance, which was held in Woolton on 6 July at the St. Peter's Church Garden Fete. Lennon then asked McCartney to join the band. McCartney said that Aunt Mimi was very aware that John's friends were lower class, and would often patronize him when he arrived to visit Lennon. According to McCartney's brother Mike, their father similarly disapproved of Lennon, declaring that Lennon would get his son into trouble. McCartney's father nevertheless allowed the fledgling band to rehearse in the family's front room at 24th Lynn Road. During this time Lennon wrote his first song, Hello Little Girl, which became a UK top 10 hit for the Foremost in 1963. McCartney recommended that his friend George Harrison become the lead guitarist. Lennon thought that Harrison, then 14 years old, was too young. McCartney engineered an audition on the upper deck of a Liverpool bus, where Harrison played raunchy for Lennon, and was asked to join. Stuart Sutcliffe, Lennon's friend from art school, later joined as bassist. Lennon, McCartney, Harrison, and Sutcliffe became the Beatles in early 1960. In August that year, the Beatles were engaged for a 48-night residency in Hamburg, in West Germany, and were desperately in need of a drummer. They asked Pete Best to join them. Lennon's aunt, horrified when he told her about the trip, pleaded with Lennon to continue his art studies instead. After the first Hamburg residency, the band accepted another in April 1961, and a third in April 1962. As with the other band members, Lennon was introduced to Preludin while in Hamburg, and regularly took the drug as a stimulant during their long, overnight performances. Brian Epstein managed the Beatles from 1962 until his death in 1967. He had no previous experience managing artists, but he had a strong influence on the group's dress code and attitude on stage. Lennon initially resisted his attempts to encourage the band to present a professional appearance, but eventually complied, saying I'll wear a bloody balloon if somebody's going to pay me. McCartney took over on bass after Sutcliffe decided to stay in Hamburg, and Best was replaced with drummer Ringo Starr. This completed the four-piece lineup that would remain until the group's breakup in 1970. The band's first single, Love Me Do, was released in October 1962, and reached No. 17 on the British charts. They recorded their debut album, Please Please Me, in under 10 hours on February 11, 1963, a day when Lennon was suffering the effects of a cold, which is evident in the vocal on the last song to be recorded that day, Twist and Shout. The Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership yielded 8 of its 14 tracks. With a few exceptions, one being the album title itself, Lennon had yet to bring his love of wordplay to bear on his song lyrics, saying, "We were just writing songs. Pop songs with no more thought of them than that, to create a sound." And the words were almost irrelevant. In a 1987 interview, McCartney said that the other Beatles idolized Lennon. He was like our own little Elvis. We all looked up to John. He was older, and he was very much the leader. He was the quickest wit, and the smartest. The Beatles achieved mainstream success in the UK early in 1963. Lennon was on tour when his first son, Julian, was born in April. During their Royal Variety Show performance, which was attended by the Queen Mother, and other British royalty, Lennon poked fun at the audience. For our next song, I'd like to ask for your help. For the people in the cheaper seats, clap your hands. And the rest of you, if you'll just rattle your jewelry. After a year of Beatlemania in the UK, the group's historic February 1964 US debut appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show marked their breakthrough to international stardom. A 2-year period of constant touring, filmmaking, and songwriting followed, during which Lennon wrote 2 books, in his own right, and a Spaniard in the works. The Beatles received recognition from the British establishment when they were appointed members of the Order of the British Empire, MBE, in the 1965 Queen's Birthday Honours. Lennon grew concerned that fans who attended Beatles concerts were unable to hear the music above the screaming of fans, and that the band's musicianship was beginning to suffer as a result. Lennon's Help! Expressed his own feelings in 1965, "I meant it. It was me singing Help." He had put on weight. He would later refer to this as his Fat Elvis period, and felt he was subconsciously seeking change. In March that year he and Harrison were unknowingly introduced to LSD when a dentist, hosting a dinner party attended by the 2 musicians, and their wives, spiked the guests' coffee with the drug. When they wanted to leave, their host revealed what they had taken, and strongly advised them not to leave the house because of the likely effects. Later, in a lift at a nightclub, they all believed it was on fire. Lennon recalled, "We were all screaming, hot, and hysterical." In March 1966, during an interview with Evening Standard reporter Maureen Cleave, Lennon remarked, "Christianity will go. It will vanish, and shrink. We're more popular than Jesus now, "I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity." The comment went virtually unnoticed in England but caused great offense in the US when quoted by a magazine there 5 months later. The furor that followed, which included the burning of Beatles records, Ku Klux Klan activity, and threats against Lennon, contributed to the band's decision to stop touring. After the band's final concert on August 29, 1966, Lennon filmed the anti-war black comedy How I Won the War, his only appearance in a non-Beatles feature film, before rejoining his bandmates for an extended period of recording, beginning in November. Lennon had increased his use of LSD, and, according to author Ian MacDonald, his continuous use of the drug in 1967 brought him close to erasing his identity. The year 1967 saw the release of Strawberry Fields Forever, hailed by Time magazine for its astonishing inventiveness, and the group's landmark album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which revealed lyrics by Lennon that contrasted strongly with the simple love songs of the group's early years. In late June, the Beatles performed Lennon's All You Need Is Love as Britain's contribution to the Our World satellite broadcast, before an international audience estimated it up to 400 million. Intentionally simplistic in its message, the song formalized his pacifist stance, and provided an anthem for the summer of love. After the Beatles were introduced to the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the group attended an August weekend of personal instruction at his Transcendental Meditation Seminar in Bangor, Wales. During the seminar, they were informed of Epstein's death. "I knew we were in trouble then," Lennon said later. "I didn't have any misconceptions about our ability to do anything other than play music. I was scared. I thought, we've fucking had it now." McCartney organized the group's first post-Epstein project, the self-written, produced, and directed television film Magical Mystery Tour, which was released in December that year. While the film itself proved to be their first critical flop, its soundtrack release, featuring Lennon's Lewis Carroll-inspired I Am the Walrus, was a success. Led by Harrison, and Lennon's interest, the Beatles traveled to the Maharishi's ashram in India in February 1968 for further guidance. While there, they composed most of the songs for their double album The Beatles, but the band members' mixed experience with Transcendental Meditation signaled a sharp divergence in the group's camaraderie. On their return to London, they became increasingly involved in business activities with the formation of Apple Corp., a multimedia corporation composed of Apple Records, and several other subsidiary companies. Lennon described the venture as an attempt to achieve artistic freedom within a business structure. Released amid the protests of 1968, the band's debut single for the Apple label included Lennon's B-side Revolution, in which he called for a plan rather than committing to Maoist revolution. The song's pacifist message led to ridicule from political radicals in the New Left press. Adding to the tensions at the Beatles' recording sessions that year, Lennon insisted on having his new girlfriend, the Japanese artist Yoko Ono, beside him, thereby contravening the band's policy regarding wives and girlfriends in the studio. He was especially pleased with his songwriting contributions to the double album, and identified it as a superior work to Sgt. Pepper. At the end of 1968, Lennon participated in the Rolling Stones' Rock and Roll Circus, a television special that was not broadcast. Lennon performed with the Dirty Mac, a supergroup composed of Lennon, Eric Clapton, Keith Richards, and Mitch Mitchell. The group also backed a vocal performance by Ono. A film version was released in 1996. By late 1968, Lennon's increased drug use, and growing preoccupation with Ono, combined with the Beatles' inability to agree on how the company should be run, left Apple in need of professional management. Lennon asked Lord Beeching to take on the role but he declined, advising Lennon to go back to making records. Lennon was approached by Alan Klein, who had managed the Rolling Stones, and other bands during the British invasion. In early 1969, Klein was appointed as Apple's chief executive by Lennon, Harrison, and Starr, but McCartney never signed the management contract. Lennon and Ono were married on March 20, 1969, and soon released a series of 14 lithographs called Bag 1 depicting scenes from their honeymoon, 8 of which were deemed indecent, and most of which were banned and confiscated. Lennon's creative focus continued to move beyond the Beatles, and between 1968 and 1969 he and Ono recorded 3 albums of experimental music together: Unfinished Music No. 1, 2 Virgins, known more for its cover than for its music, Unfinished Music No. 2, Life with the Lions, and Wedding Album. In 1969, they formed the Plastic Ono Band, releasing Live Peace in Toronto, 1969. Between 1969 and 1970, Lennon released the singles Give Peace a Chance, which was widely adopted as an anti-Vietnam War anthem, Cold Turkey, which documented his withdrawal symptoms after he became addicted to heroin, and Instant Karma. In protest at Britain's involvement in the Nigeria-Biafra thing, namely, the Nigerian Civil War, its support of America in the Vietnam War, and, perhaps jokingly, against Cold Turkey slipping down the charts, Lennon returned his MBE medal to the Queen. This gesture had no effect on his MBE status, which could not be renounced. The medal, together with Lennon's letter, is held at the Central Chancery of the Orders of Knighthood. Lennon left the Beatles in September 1969, but agreed not to inform the media while the group renegotiated their recording contract. He was outraged that McCartney publicized his own departure on releasing his debut solo album in April 1970. Lennon's reaction was, "Jesus Christ. He gets all the credit for it." He later wrote, "I started the band. I disbanded it. It's as simple as that." In a December 1970 interview with Jan Wenner of Rolling Stone magazine, he revealed his bitterness towards McCartney, saying, "I was a fool not to do what Paul did, which was use it to sell a record." Lennon also spoke of the hostility he perceived the other members had towards Ono, and of how he, Harrison, and Starr got fed up with being sidemen for Paul. "After Brian Epstein died we collapsed. Paul took over, and supposedly led us. But what is leading us when we went round in circles?" Between 1 April and September 15, 1970, Lennon and Ono went through primal therapy with Arthur Janov at Tittenhurst, in London, and at Janov's clinic in Los Angeles, California. Designed to release emotional pain from early childhood, the therapy entailed 2 half-days a week with Janov for 6 months. He had wanted to treat the couple for longer, but their American visa ran out, and they had to return to the UK. Lennon's debut solo album, John Lennon / Plastic Ono Band, 1970, was received with praise by many music critics, but its highly personal lyrics and stark sound limited its commercial performance. The album featured the song Mother, in which Lennon confronted his feelings of childhood rejection, and the Dylan-esque working-class hero, a bitter attack against the bourgeois social system which, due to the lyric "You're still fucking peasants," fell foul of broadcasters. In January 1971, Tariq Ali expressed his revolutionary political views when he interviewed Lennon, who immediately responded by writing "Power to the People." In his lyrics to the song, Lennon reversed the non-confrontational approach he had espoused in Revolution, although he later disowned "Power to the People," saying that it was born out of guilt, and a desire for approval from radicals such as Ali. Lennon became involved in a protest against the prosecution of Oz magazine for alleged obscenity. Lennon denounced the proceedings as disgusting fascism, and he, and Ono, as Elastic Oz Band, released the single God Save Us / Do the Oz, and joined marches in support of the magazine. Eager for a major commercial success, Lennon adopted a more accessible sound for his next album, Imagine, 1971. Rolling Stone reported that it contains a substantial portion of good music but warned of the possibility that his posturings will soon seem not merely dull but irrelevant. The album's title track later became an anthem for anti-war movements, while the song How Do You Sleep? Was a musical attack on McCartney in response to lyrics on Ram that Lennon felt, and McCartney later confirmed, were directed at him, and Ono. In Jealous Guy, Lennon addressed his demeaning treatment of women, acknowledging that his past behavior was the result of long-held insecurity. In gratitude for his guitar contributions to Imagine, Lennon initially agreed to perform at Harrison's concert for Bangladesh benefit shows in New York. Harrison refused to allow Ono to participate at the concerts, however, which resulted in the couple having a heated argument, and Lennon pulling out of the event. Lennon and Ono moved to New York in August 1971, and immediately embraced U.S. radical left politics. The couple released their Happy Christmas, War Is Over single in December. During the new year, the Nixon administration took what it called a strategic countermeasure against Lennon's anti-war and anti-Nixon propaganda. The administration embarked on what would be a 4-year attempt to deport him. Lennon was embroiled in a continuing legal battle with the immigration authorities, and he was denied permanent residency in the U.S. The issue would not be resolved until 1976. Sometime in New York City was recorded as a collaboration with Ono, and was released in 1972 with backing from the New York band Elephant's Memory. A double LP, it contained songs about women's rights, race relations, Britain's role in Northern Ireland, and Lennon's difficulties in obtaining a green card. The album was a commercial failure, and was maligned by critics, who found its political sloganeering heavy-handed and relentless. The Enemy's review took the form of an open letter in which Tony Tyler derided Lennon as a pathetic, aging revolutionary. In the US, Woman is the Nigger of the World was released as a single from the album, and was televised on 11th of May, on The Dick Cavett Show. Many radio stations refused to broadcast the song because of the word nigger. Lennon and Ono gave 2 benefit concerts with Elephant's Memory, and guests in New York in aid of patients at the Willowbrook State School Mental Facility. Staged at Madison Square Garden on August 30, 1972, they were his last full-length concert appearances. After George McGovern lost the 1972 presidential election to Richard Nixon, Lennon and Ono attended a post-election wake held in the New York home of activist Jerry Rubin. Lennon was depressed and got intoxicated. He left Ono embarrassed after he had sex with a female guest. Ono's song Death of Samantha was inspired by the incident. As Lennon was about to record Mind Games in 1973, he and Ono decided to separate. The ensuing 18-month period apart, which he later called his Lost Weekend in reference to the film of the same name, was spent in Los Angeles and New York City in the company of Maypang. Mind Games, credited to the Plastic Ono Band, was released in November 1973. Lennon also contributed I'm the Greatest to Star's album Ringo, 1973, released the same month. With Harrison joining Starr and Lennon at the recording session for the song, it marked the only occasion when 3 former Beatles recorded together between the band's breakup and Lennon's death. In early 1974, Lennon was drinking heavily, and his alcohol-fueled antics with Harry Nilsson made headlines. In March, 2 widely publicized incidents occurred at the Troubadour Club. In the first incident, Lennon stuck an unused menstrual pad on his forehead and scuffled with a waitress. The second incident occurred 2 weeks later, when Lennon and Nilsson were ejected from the same club after heckling the Smothers Brothers. Lennon decided to produce Nilsson's album Pussycats, and Pang rented a Los Angeles beach house for all the musicians. After a month of further debauchery, the recording sessions were in chaos, and Lennon returned to New York with Pang to finish work on the album. In April, Lennon had produced the Mick Jagger song Too Many Cooks, Spoil the Soup, which was, for contractual reasons, to remain unreleased for more than 30 years. Pang supplied the recording for its eventual inclusion on The Very Best of Mick Jagger, 2007. Lennon had settled back in New York when he recorded the album Walls and Bridges. Released in October 1974, it included Whatever Gets You Through the Night, which featured Elton John on backing vocals and piano, and became Lennon's only single as a solo artist to top the US Billboard Hot 100 chart during his lifetime. A second single from the album, Number 9 Dream, followed before the end of the year. Star's Goodnight Vienna, 1974, again saw assistance from Lennon, who wrote the title track and played piano. On 28th of November, Lennon made a surprise guest appearance at Elton John's Thanksgiving concert at Madison Square Garden, in fulfillment of his promise to join the singer in a live show if Whatever Gets You Through the Night, a song whose commercial potential Lennon had doubted, reached number 1. Lennon performed the song along with Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, and I Saw Her Standing There, which he introduced as a song by an old estranged fiancé of mine called Paul. In the first 2 weeks of January 1975, Elton John topped the US Billboard Hot 100 singles chart with his cover of Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, featuring Lennon on guitar and backing vocals. Lennon is credited on the single under the moniker of Drive, Winston O Boogie. As January became February, Lennon and Ono reunited as Lennon and Bowie completed recording of their co-composition Fame, which became David Bowie's first US number 1, featuring guitar and backing vocals by Lennon. In February, Lennon released Rock and Roll, 1975, an album of cover songs. Stand By Me, taken from the album, and a US and UK hit, became his last single for 5 years. He made what would be his final stage appearance in the ATV special A Salute to Lou Grade, recorded on 18th of April, and televised in June. Playing acoustic guitar, and backed by an 8-piece band, Lennon performed 2 songs from Rock and Roll, Stand By Me, which was not broadcast, and Slippin' and Slidin', followed by Imagine. The band, known as Etc., wore masks behind their heads, a dig by Lennon, who thought Grade was two-faced. Sean was Lennon's only child with Ono. Sean was born on October 9, 1975, Lennon's 35th birthday, and John took on the role of house husband. Lennon began what would be a 5-year hiatus from the music industry, during which time, he later said, he baked bread and looked after the baby. He devoted himself to Sean, rising at 6 a.m. daily to plan and prepare his meals, and to spend time with him. He wrote Cookin' in the Kitchen of Love for Star's Ringo's Rotogravure, 1976, performing on the track in June in what would be his last recording session until 1980. He formally announced his break from music in Tokyo in 1977, saying, "We have basically decided, without any great decision, to be with our baby as much as we can until we feel we can take time off to indulge ourselves in creating things outside of the family." During his career break he created several series of drawings, and drafted a book containing a mix of autobiographical material, and what he termed mad stuff, all of which would be published posthumously. Lennon emerged from his hiatus in October 1980, when he released the single, Just Like, Starting Over. In November, he and Ono released the album Double Fantasy, which included songs Lennon had written in Bermuda. In June, Lennon chartered a 43-foot sailboat, and embarked on a sailing trip to Bermuda. En route, he and the crew encountered a storm, rendering everyone on board seasick, except Lennon, who took control, and sailed the boat through the storm. This experience reinvigorated him, and his creative muse. He spent 3 weeks in Bermuda in a home called Fairylands writing and refining the tracks for the upcoming album. The music reflected Lennon's fulfillment in his newfound stable family life. Sufficient additional material was recorded for a planned follow-up album Milk and Honey, which was issued posthumously in 1984. Double Fantasy was not well received initially, and drew comments such as Melody Maker's indulgent sterility, a god-awful yawn. At approximately 5 p.m. on December 8, 1980, Lennon autographed a copy of Double Fantasy for Mark David Chapman before leaving the Dakota with Ono for a recording session at the record plant. After the session, Lennon and Ono returned to the Dakota in a limousine at around 10:50 p.m. EST. They left the vehicle and walked through the archway of the building. Chapman then shot Lennon twice in the back and twice in the shoulder at close range. Lennon was rushed in a police cruiser to the emergency room of Roosevelt Hospital, where he was pronounced dead on arrival at 11:15 p.m. EST. Ono issued a statement the next day, saying there is no funeral for John, ending it with the words, "John loved and prayed for the human race. Please do the same for him." His remains were cremated at Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York. Ono scattered his ashes in New York's Central Park, where the Strawberry Fields Memorial was later created. Chapman avoided going to trial when he ignored his lawyer's advice, and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, and was sentenced to 20 years to life. In the weeks following the murder, Just Like, Starting Over, and Double Fantasy topped the charts in the UK and the US. Imagine hit number 1 in the UK in January 1981, and Happy Christmas peaked at number 2. Imagine was succeeded at the top of the UK chart by Woman, the second single from Double Fantasy. Later that year, Roxy Music's cover version of Jealous Guy, recorded as a tribute to Lennon, was also a UK number 1. Lennon met Cynthia Powell, 1939 to 2015, in 1957, when they were fellow students at the Liverpool College of Art. Although Powell was intimidated by Lennon's attitude and appearance, she heard that he was obsessed with the French actress Brigitte Bardot, so she dyed her hair blonde. Lennon asked her out, but when she said that she was engaged, he shouted, "I didn't ask you to fucking marry me, did I?" She often accompanied him to Quarrymen gigs, and traveled to Hamburg with McCartney's girlfriend to visit him. Lennon was jealous by nature, and eventually grew possessive, often terrifying Powell with his anger. In her 2005 memoir John, Powell recalled that, when they were dating, Lennon once struck her after he observed her dancing with Stuart Sutcliffe. She ended their relationship as a result, until 3 months later, when Lennon apologized and asked to reunite. She took him back, and later noted that he was never again physically abusive towards her, although he could still be verbally cutting and unkind. Lennon later said that until he met Ono, he had never questioned his chauvinistic attitude towards women. Despite the fact that he said that the Beatles song Getting Better told his, or his peers', own story. "I used to be cruel to my woman, and physically, any woman. I was a hitter. I couldn't express myself, and I hit. I fought men, and I hit women. That is why I am always on about peace." There is no further evidence of him ever having struck a woman again. Recalling his July 1962 reaction when he learned that Cynthia was pregnant, Lennon said, "There's only one thing for its sin. We'll have to get married." The couple wed on 23rd of August at the Mount Pleasant Register Office in Liverpool, with Brian Epstein serving as best man. His marriage began just as Beatlemania was taking off across the UK. He performed on the evening of his wedding day, and would continue to do so almost daily from then on. Epstein feared that fans would be alienated by the idea of a married Beatle, and he asked the Lennons to keep their marriage secret. Julian was born on April 8, 1963, Lennon was on tour at the time, and did not see his infant son until 3 days later. Cynthia attributed the start of the marriage breakdown to Lennon's use of LSD, and she felt that he slowly lost interest in her as a result of his use of the drug. When the group traveled by train to Bangor, Wales in 1967 for the Maharishi Yogi's Transcendental Meditation Seminar, a policeman did not recognize her, and stopped her from boarding. She later recalled how the incident seemed to symbolize the end of their marriage. After spending a holiday in Greece, Cynthia arrived home at Kenwood to find Lennon sitting on the floor with Ono in terry cloth robes, and left the house, feeling shocked and humiliated, to stay with friends. A few weeks later, Alexis Martis informed Powell that Lennon was seeking a divorce and custody of Julian. She received a letter stating that Lennon was doing so on the grounds of her adultery with Italian hotelier Roberto Bassanini, an accusation which Powell denied. After negotiations, Lennon capitulated, and agreed to let her divorce him on the same grounds. The case was settled out of court in November 1968, with Lennon giving her £100,000, $240,000 in US dollars at the time, a small annual payment, and custody of Julian. The Beatles were performing at Liverpool's Cavern Club in November 1961 when they were introduced to Brian Epstein after a midday concert. Epstein was homosexual, and closeted, and according to biographer Philip Norman, one of Epstein's reasons for wanting to manage the group was that he was attracted to Lennon. Almost as soon as Julian was born, Lennon went on holiday to Spain with Epstein, which led to speculation about their relationship. When he was later questioned about it, Lennon said, "Well, it was almost a love affair, but not quite. It was never consummated. But it was a pretty intense relationship. It was my first experience with a homosexual that I was conscious was homosexual. We used to sit in a cafe in Torremolinos looking at all the boys, and I'd say, 'Do you like that one? Do you like this one?' I was rather enjoying the experience, thinking like a writer all the time, I am experiencing this." Soon after their return from Spain, at McCartney's 21st birthday party in June 1963, Lennon physically attacked Cavern Club Master of Ceremonies Bob Weller for saying, "How was your honeymoon, John?" The MC, known for his wordplay and affectionate but cutting remarks, was making a joke, but 10 months had passed since Lennon's marriage, and the deferred honeymoon was still 2 months in the future. Lennon was drunk at the time, and the matter was simple, he called me a queer so I battered his bloody ribs in. Lennon delighted in mocking Epstein for his homosexuality, and for the fact that he was Jewish. When Epstein invited suggestions for the title of his autobiography, Lennon offered Queer Jew. On learning of the eventual title, A Cellar Full of Noise, he parodied, "More like a cellar full of boys." He demanded of a visitor to Epstein's flat, "Have you come to blackmail him? If not, you're the only bugger in London who hasn't." During the recording of Baby, You're a Rich Man, he sang altered choruses of Baby, You're a Rich Fag Jew. During his marriage to Cynthia, Lennon's first son Julian was born at the same time that his commitments with the Beatles were intensifying at the height of Beatlemania. Lennon was touring with the Beatles when Julian was born on April 8, 1963. Julian's birth, like his mother Cynthia's marriage to Lennon, was kept secret because Epstein was convinced that public knowledge of such things would threaten the Beatles' commercial success. Julian recalled that as a small child in Weybridge some 4 years later, "I was trundled home from school, and came walking up with one of my watercolor paintings. It was just a bunch of stars, and this blonde girl I knew at school. And Dad said, 'What's this?' I said, 'It's Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds.'" Lennon used it as the title of a Beatles song, and though it was later reported to have been derived from the initials LSD, Lennon insisted, "It's not an acid song." Lennon was distant from Julian, who felt closer to McCartney than to his father. During a car journey to visit Cynthia, and Julian during Lennon's divorce, McCartney composed a song, "Hey Jules," to comfort him. It would evolve into the Beatles song Hey Jude. Lennon later said, "That's his best song. It started off as a song about my son Julian. He turned it into Hey Jude. I always thought it was about me and Yoko, but he said it wasn't." Lennon's relationship with Julian was already strained, and after Lennon and Ono moved to New York in 1971, Julian did not see his father again until 1973. With Pang's encouragement, arrangements were made for Julian and his mother to visit Lennon in Los Angeles, where they went to Disneyland. Julian started to see his father regularly, and Lennon gave him a drumming part on the Walls and Bridges track. He bought Julian a Gibson Les Paul guitar and other instruments, and encouraged his interest in music by demonstrating guitar chord techniques. Julian recalls that he and his father got on a great deal better during the time he spent in New York. "We had a lot of fun, laughed a lot, and had a great time in general." In a Playboy interview with David Sheff shortly before his death, Lennon said, "Sean is a planned child, and therein lies the difference. I don't love Julian any less as a child. He's still my son, whether he came from a bottle of whiskey or because they didn't have pills in those days. He's here, he belongs to me, and he always will." He said he was trying to re-establish a connection with the then 17-year-old, and confidently predicted, "Julian and I will have a relationship in the future." After his death, it was revealed that he had left Julian very little in his will. Lennon first met Yoko Ono on November 9, 1966 at the Indica Gallery in London, where Ono was preparing her conceptual art exhibit. They were introduced by gallery owner John Dunbar. Lennon was intrigued by Ono's hammer and nail. Patrons hammered a nail into a wooden board, creating the art piece. Although the exhibition had not yet begun, Lennon wanted to hammer a nail into the clean board, but Ono stopped him. Dunbar asked her, "Don't you know who this is? He's a millionaire. He might buy it." According to Lennon's recollection in 1980, Ono had not heard of the Beatles, but she relented on condition that Lennon pay her 5 shillings, to which Lennon said he replied, "I'll give you an imaginary 5 shillings, and hammer an imaginary nail in." Ono subsequently related that Lennon had taken a bite out of the apple on display in her work apple, much to her fury. Ono began to telephone and visit Lennon at his home. When Cynthia asked him for an explanation, Lennon explained that Ono was only trying to obtain money for her avant-garde bullshit. While his wife was on holiday in Greece in May 1968, Lennon invited Ono to visit. They spent the night recording what would become the Two Virgins album, after which, he said, they made love at dawn. When Lennon's wife returned home, she found Ono wearing her bathrobe and drinking tea with Lennon, who simply said, "Oh, hi." Ono became pregnant in 1968 and miscarried a male child on November 21, 1968, a few weeks after Lennon's divorce from Cynthia was granted. 2 years before the Beatles disbanded, Lennon and Ono began public protests against the Vietnam War. They were married in Gibraltar on March 20, 1969, and spent their honeymoon at the Hilton Amsterdam, campaigning with a week-long bed-in for peace. They planned another bed-in in the United States, but were denied entry, so held one instead at the Queen Elizabeth Hotel in Montreal, where they recorded "Give Peace a Chance." They often combined advocacy with performance art, as in their Bagism, first introduced during a Vienna press conference. Lennon detailed this period in the Beatles song The Ballad of John and Yoko. Lennon changed his name by deed poll on April 22, 1969, adding Ono as a middle name. The brief ceremony took place on the roof of the Apple Corps building, where the Beatles had performed their rooftop concert 3 months earlier. Although he used the name John Ono Lennon thereafter, some official documents referred to him as John Winston Ono Lennon. The couple settled at Tittenhurst Park at Sunninghill in Berkshire. After Ono was injured in a car accident, Lennon arranged for a king-size bed to be brought to the recording studio as he worked on the Beatles' album, Abbey Road. Ono and Lennon moved to New York, to a flat on Bank Street, Greenwich Village. Looking for somewhere with better security, they relocated in 1973 to the more secure Dakota overlooking Central Park at 1 West 72nd Street. Abco Industries was formed in 1968 by Alan Klein as an umbrella company to Abco Records. Klein hired May Pang as a receptionist in 1969. Through involvement in a project with Abco, Lennon and Ono met her the following year. She became their personal assistant. In 1973, after she had been working with the couple for 3 years, Ono confided that she and Lennon were becoming estranged. She went on to suggest that Pang should begin a physical relationship with Lennon, telling her, "He likes you a lot." Astounded by Ono's proposition, Pang nevertheless agreed to become Lennon's companion. The pair soon left for Los Angeles, beginning an 18-month period he later called his Lost Weekend. In Los Angeles, Pang encouraged Lennon to develop regular contact with Julian, whom he had not seen for 2 years. He also rekindled friendships with Starr, McCartney, Beatles roadie Mal Evans, and Harry Nilsson. In June, Lennon and Pang returned to Manhattan in their newly rented penthouse apartment where they prepared a spare room for Julian when he visited them. Lennon, who had been inhibited by Ono in this regard, began to re-establish contact with other relatives and friends. By December, he and Pang were considering a house purchase, and he refused to accept Ono's telephone calls. In January 1975, he agreed to meet Ono, who claimed to have found a cure for smoking. After the meeting, he failed to return home or call Pang. When Pang telephoned the next day, Ono told her that Lennon was unavailable because he was exhausted after a hypnotherapy session. 2 days later, Lennon reappeared at a joint dental appointment. He was stupefied and confused to such an extent that Pang believed he had been brainwashed. Lennon told Pang that his separation from Ono was now over, although Ono would allow him to continue seeing her as his mistress. Ono had previously suffered 3 miscarriages in her attempt to have a child with Lennon. When Ono and Lennon were reunited, she became pregnant again. She initially said that she wanted to have an abortion but changed her mind, and agreed to allow the pregnancy to continue on the condition that Lennon adopt the role of house husband, which he agreed to do. Following Sean's birth, Lennon's subsequent hiatus from the music industry would span 5 years. He had a photographer take pictures of Sean every day of his first year, and created numerous drawings for him, which were posthumously published as Real Love, The Drawings for Sean. Lennon later proudly declared, "He didn't come out of my belly but, by God, I made his bones, because I've attended to every meal, and to how he sleeps, and to the fact that he swims like a fish." While Lennon remained consistently friendly with Starr during the years that followed the Beatles' breakup in 1970, his relationships with McCartney and Harrison varied. He was initially close to Harrison, but the two drifted apart after Lennon moved to the US in 1971. When Harrison was in New York for his December 1974 Dark Horse tour, Lennon agreed to join him on stage but failed to appear after an argument over Lennon's refusal to sign an agreement that would finally dissolve the Beatles' legal partnership. Harrison later said that when he visited Lennon during his 5 years away from music, he sensed that Lennon was trying to communicate, but his bond with Ono prevented him. Harrison offended Lennon in 1980 when he published an autobiography that Lennon felt made little mention of him. Lennon told Playboy, "I was hurt by it. By glaring omission. My influence on his life is absolutely zilch." He remembers every 2-bit sax player or guitarist he met in subsequent years. "I'm not in the book." Lennon's most intense feelings were reserved for McCartney. In addition to attacking him with the lyrics of How Do You Sleep?, Lennon argued with him through the press for 3 years after the group split. The two later began to re-establish something of the close friendship they had once known, and in 1974, they even played music together again before eventually growing apart once more. During McCartney's final visit in April 1976, Lennon said that they watched the episode of Saturday Night Live in which Lorne Michaels made a $3,000 offer to get the Beatles to reunite on the show. According to Lennon, the pair considered going to the studio to make a joke appearance, attempting to claim their share of the money, but they were too tired. Lennon summarized his feelings towards McCartney in an interview 3 days before his death. "Throughout my career, I've selected to work with only 2 people, Paul McCartney and Yoko Ono. That ain't bad picking." Along with his estrangement from McCartney, Lennon always felt a musical competitiveness with him, and kept an ear on his music. During his career break from 1975 until shortly before his death, according to Fred Seaman, Lennon, and Ono's assistant at the time, Lennon was content to sit back as long as McCartney was producing what Lennon saw as mediocre material. Lennon took notice when McCartney released Coming Up in 1980, which was the year Lennon returned to the studio. "It's driving me crackers," he jokingly complained, because he could not get the tune out of his head. That same year, Lennon was asked whether the group were dreaded enemies or the best of friends, and he replied that they were neither, and that he had not seen any of them in a long time. But he also said, "I still love those guys. The Beatles are over, but John, Paul, George, and Ringo go on." Lennon and Ono used their honeymoon as a bed-in for peace at the Amsterdam Hilton Hotel. The March 1969 event attracted worldwide media ridicule. During a second bed-in 3 months later at the Queen Elizabeth Hotel in Montreal, Lennon wrote and recorded Give Peace a Chance. Released as a single, the song was quickly interpreted as an anti-war anthem, and sung by 250,000 demonstrators against the Vietnam War in Washington, D.C., on 15th of November, the second Vietnam Moratorium Day. In December, they paid for billboards in 10 cities around the world which declared, in the national language, "War is over." if you want it. During the year, Lennon and Ono began to support efforts by the family of James Hunratty to prove his innocence. Hunratty had been hanged in 1962. According to Lennon, those who had condemned Hunratty were the same people who are running guns to South Africa and killing blacks in the streets. The same bastards are in control, the same people are running everything, it's the whole bullshit bourgeois scene. In London, Lennon and Ono staged a Britain Murdered Hunratty banner march and a silent protest for James Hunratty, and produced a 40-minute documentary on the case. At an appeal hearing more than 30 years later, Hunratty's conviction was upheld after DNA evidence was found to match. Lennon and Ono showed their solidarity with the Clydeside UCS workers' work in 1971 by sending a bouquet of red roses and a check for £5,000. On moving to New York City in August that year, they befriended two of the Chicago 7 UP peace activists, Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman. Another political activist, John Sinclair, poet and co-founder of the White Panther Party, was serving 10 years in prison for selling 2 joints of marijuana after previous convictions for possession of the drug. In December 1971 at Ann Arbor, Michigan, 15,000 people attended the John Sinclair Freedom Rally, a protest and benefit concert with contributions from Lennon, Stevie Wonder, Bob Seger, Bobby Seale of the Black Panther Party, and others. Lennon and Ono, backed by David Peel and Jerry Rubin, performed an acoustic set of 4 songs from their forthcoming Sometime in New York City album, including John Sinclair, whose lyrics called for his release. The day before the rally, the Michigan Senate passed a bill that significantly reduced the penalties for possession of marijuana, and 4 days later Sinclair was released on an appeal bond. The performance was recorded, and 2 of the tracks later appeared on John Lennon Anthology, 1998. Following the Bloody Sunday incident in Northern Ireland in 1972, Lennon said that given the choice between the British Army and the IRA, he would side with the latter. Lennon and Ono wrote 2 songs protesting British presence and actions in Ireland for their Sometime in New York City album, The Luck of the Irish, and Sunday Bloody Sunday. In 2000, David Shaler, a former member of Britain's Domestic Security Service MI5, suggested that Lennon had given money to the IRA, though this was swiftly denied by Ono. Biographer Bill Harry records that following Bloody Sunday, Lennon and Ono financially supported the production of the film The Irish Tapes, a political documentary with an Irish Republican slant. In February 2000, Lennon's cousin Stanley Parks stated that the singer had given money to the IRA during the 1970s. According to FBI surveillance reports, and confirmed by Tariq Ali in 2006, Lennon was sympathetic to the International Marxist Group, a Trotskyist group formed in Britain in 1968. However, the FBI considered Lennon to have limited effectiveness as a revolutionary, as he was constantly under the influence of narcotics. In 1972, Lennon contributed a drawing and limerick titled "Why Make It Sad to Be Gay?" to Len Richmond and Gary Nogueira's The Gay Liberation Book. Lennon's last act of political activism was a statement in support of the striking minority sanitation workers in San Francisco on December 5, 1980. He and Ono planned to join the workers' protest on 14th of December. Following the impact of Give Peace a Chance and Happy Christmas, War is Over on the anti-war movement, the Nixon administration heard rumors of Lennon's involvement in a concert to be held in San Diego at the same time as the Republican National Convention, and tried to have him deported. Nixon believed that Lennon's anti-war activities could cost him his re-election. Republican Senator Strom Thurmond suggested in a February 1972 memo that deportation would be a strategic countermeasure against Lennon. The next month, the United States Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, began deportation proceedings, arguing that his 1968 misdemeanor conviction for cannabis possession in London had made him ineligible for admission to the United States. Lennon spent the next 3.5 years in and out of deportation hearings until October 8, 1975, when a court of appeals barred the deportation attempt, stating the courts will not condone selective deportation based upon secret political grounds. While the legal battle continued, Lennon attended rallies and made television appearances. He and Ono co-hosted The Mike Douglas Show for a week in February 1972, introducing guests such as Jerry Rubin and Bobby Seale to Mid-America. In 1972, Bob Dylan wrote a letter to the INS defending Lennon, stating, "John and Yoko had a great voice and drive to the country's so-called art institution. They inspire and transcend and stimulate, and by doing so, only help others to see pure light, and in doing that, put an end to this dull taste of petty commercialism which is being passed off as artist art by the overpowering mass media. Hooray for John and Yoko. Let them stay, and live here, and breathe. The country's got plenty of room and space. Let John and Yoko stay. On March 23, 1973, Lennon was ordered to leave the US within 60 days. Ono, meanwhile, was granted permanent residence. In response, Lennon and Ono held a press conference on April 1, 1973 at the New York City Bar Association, where they announced the formation of the state of Nutopia, a place with no land, no boundaries, no passports, only people. Waving the white flag of Nutopia, two handkerchiefs, they asked for political asylum in the US. The press conference was filmed, and appeared in a 2006 documentary, The US vs. John Lennon. Soon after the press conference, Nixon's involvement in a political scandal came to light, and in June the Watergate hearings began in Washington, D.C. They led to the president's resignation 14 months later. In December 1974, when he and members of his tour entourage visited the White House, Harrison asked Gerald Ford, Nixon's successor, to intercede in the matter. Ford's administration showed little interest in continuing the battle against Lennon, and the deportation order was overturned in 1975. The following year, Lennon received his green card certifying his permanent residency, and when Jimmy Carter was inaugurated as president in January 1977, Lennon and Ono attended the inaugural ball. After Lennon's death, historian John Wiener filed a Freedom of Information Act request for FBI files that documented the Bureau's role in the deportation attempt. The FBI admitted it had 281 pages of files on Lennon, but refused to release most of them on the grounds that they contained national security information. In 1983, Wiener sued the FBI with the help of the American Civil Liberties Union of Southern California. It took 14 years of litigation to force the FBI to release the withheld pages. The ACLU, representing Wiener, won a favorable decision in their suit against the FBI in the Ninth Circuit in 1991. The Justice Department appealed the decision to the Supreme Court in April 1992, but the court declined to review the case. In 1997, respecting President Bill Clinton's newly instigated rule that documents should be withheld only if releasing them would involve foreseeable harm, the Justice Department settled most of the outstanding issues outside court by releasing all but 10 of the contested documents. Wiener published the results of his 14-year campaign in January 2000. Gimme Some Truth. The John Lennon FBI files contained facsimiles of the documents, including lengthy reports by confidential informants detailing the daily lives of anti-war activists, memos to the White House, transcripts of TV shows on which Lennon appeared, and a proposal that Lennon be arrested by local police on drug charges. The story is told in the documentary The US vs. John Lennon. The final 10 documents in Lennon's FBI file, which reported on his ties with London anti-war activists in 1971, and had been withheld as containing national security information provided by a foreign government under an explicit promise of confidentiality, were released in December 2006. They contained no indication that the British government had regarded Lennon as a serious threat. One example of the released material was a report that two prominent British leftists had hoped Lennon would finance a left-wing bookshop and reading room. Beatles biographer Bill Harry wrote that Lennon began drawing and writing creatively at an early age with the encouragement of his uncle. He collected his stories, poetry, cartoons, and caricatures in a Quarry Bank High School exercise book that he called The Daily Howl. The drawings were often of crippled people, and the writing satirical, and throughout the book was an abundance of wordplay. According to classmate Bill Turner, Lennon created The Daily Howl to amuse his best friend, and later Quarrymen bandmate Pete Shotton, to whom he would show his work before he let anyone else see it. Turner said that Lennon had an obsession for Wigan Pier. It kept cropping up, and in Lennon's story A Carrot and a Potato Mine, the mine was at the end of Wigan Pier. Turner described how one of Lennon's cartoons depicted a bus stop sign annotated with the question, "Why?" Above was a flying pancake, and below, a blind man wearing glasses leading along a blind dog, also wearing glasses. Lennon's love of wordplay and nonsense with a twist found a wider audience when he was 24. Harry writes that in his own right, 1964, was published after some journalist who was hanging around the Beatles came to me, and I ended up showing him the stuff. They said, "Write a book," and that's how the first one came about. Like the Daily Howl, it contained a mix of formats including short stories, poetry, plays, and drawings. One story, Good Dog Nigel, tells the tale of a happy dog, urinating on a lamp post, barking, wagging his tail, until he suddenly hears a message that he will be killed at 3 o'clock. The Times literary supplement considered the poems and stories remarkable. Also very funny. The nonsense runs on, words and images prompting one another in a chain of pure fantasy. Book Week reported, "This is nonsense writing, but one has only to review the literature of nonsense to see how well Lennon has brought it off. While some of his homonyms are gratuitous wordplay, many others have not only double meaning but a double edge." Lennon was not only surprised by the positive reception, but that the book was reviewed at all, and suggested that readers took the book more seriously than I did myself. "It just began as a laugh for me." In combination with A Spaniard in the Works, 1965, in his own right formed the basis of the stage play The Lennon Play, in his own right, co-adapted by Victor Spinetti and Adrienne Kennedy. After negotiations between Lennon, Spinetti, and the artistic director of the National Theatre, Sir Laurence Olivier, the play opened at the Old Vic in 1968. Lennon and Ono attended the opening night performance, their second public appearance together. In 1969, Lennon wrote Four in Hand, a skit based on his teenage experiences of group masturbation, for Kenneth Tynan's play O. Calcutta. After Lennon's death, further works were published, including Skywriting by Word of Mouth, 1986, Japan Through John Lennon's Eyes, a personal sketchbook, 1992, with Lennon's illustrations of the definitions of Japanese words, and Real Love, The Drawings for Sean, 1999. The Beatles Anthology, 2000, also presented examples of his writings and drawings. In 1967, Lennon, who had attended art school, funded, and anonymously participated in Ono's art exhibition Half a Room that was held at Lisson Gallery. Following his collaborating with Ono in the form of the Plastic Ono Band that began in 1968, Lennon became involved with the Fluxus art movement. In the summer of 1968, Lennon began showing his painting and conceptual art at his You're Here art exhibition held at Robert Fraser Gallery in London. The show, that was dedicated to Ono, included a 6-foot in diameter round white monochrome painting called You Are Here, 1968. Besides the white monochrome paint, its surface contained only the tiny handwritten inscription You Are Here. This painting, and the show in general, was conceived as a response to Ono's conceptual art piece This Is Not Here, 1966, that was part of her Fluxus installation of wall text pieces called Blue Room Event, 1966. Blue Room Event consisted of sentences that Ono wrote directly on her white New York apartment walls and ceiling. Lennon's You're Here show also included 60 charity collection boxes, a pair of Lennon's shoes with a sign that read I'd take my shoes off to you, a ready-made black bike, an apparent homage to Marcel Duchamp, and his 1917 bicycle wheel, an overturned white hat labeled for the artist, and a large glass jar full of free-to-take You're Here white pin badges. A hidden camera secretly filmed the public reaction to the show. For the 1st of July opening, Lennon, dressed all in white, as was Ono, released 365 white balloons into the city sky. Each balloon had attached to it a small paper card to be mailed back to Lennon at the Robert Fraser Gallery at 69 Duke Street, with the finder's comments. After moving to New York City, from 18 April to June 12, 1970, Lennon and Ono presented a series of Fluxus conceptual art events and concerts at Joe Jones's tone-deaf music store called Grapefruit Flux Banquet. Performances included Come impersonating John Lennon and Yoko Ono, Grapefruit Banquet, and Portrait of John Lennon as a Young Cloud by Yoko plus Everybody. That same year, Lennon also made the complete Yoko Ono word poem game, 1970, a conceptual art poem collage that utilized the cut-up, or decoupe, aleatory technique typical of the work of John Cage, and many Fluxus artists. The cut-up technique can be traced to at least the Dadaists of the 1920s, but was popularized in the early 1960s by writer William S. Burroughs. For the complete Yoko Ono word poem game, Lennon took the portrait photo of himself that was included in the packaging of the 1968 The Beatles LP, aka the White Album, and cut it into 134 small rectangles. A single word was written on the back of each fragment, to be read in any order. The portrait image was meant to be reassembled in any order. The complete Yoko Ono word poem game was presented by Lennon to Ono on 28 July in an inscribed envelope for her to randomly assemble and reassemble at will. Lennon made whimsical drawings and fine art prints on occasion until the end of his life. For example, Lennon exhibited at Eugene Schuster's London Arts Gallery his Bag 1 lithographs in an exhibition that included several depicting erotic imagery. The show opened on January 15, 1970, and 24 hours later it was raided by police officers who confiscated 8 of the 14 lithos on the grounds of indecency. The lithographs had been drawn by Lennon in 1969 chronicling his wedding and honeymoon with Yoko Ono, and one of their bed-ins staged in the interests of world peace. In 1969, Lennon appeared in the Yoko Ono Fluxus art film Self-Portrait that was premiered at the Institute of Contemporary Arts. In 1971, Lennon made an experimental art film called Erection that was edited on 16mm film by George Maciunas, founder of the Fluxus art movement, and avant-garde contemporary of Ono. The film uses the songs Airmail and You from Ono's 1971 album Fly as its soundtrack. Lennon played a mouth organ during a bus journey to visit his cousin in Scotland. The music caught the driver's ear. Impressed, the driver told Lennon of a harmonica he could have if he came to Edinburgh the following day, where one had been stored in the bus depot since a passenger had left it on a bus. The professional instrument quickly replaced Lennon's toy. He would continue to play the harmonica, often using the instrument during the Beatles' Hamburg years, and it became a signature sound in the group's early recordings. His mother taught him how to play the banjo, later buying him an acoustic guitar. At 16, he played rhythm guitar with the Quarrymen. As his career progressed, he played a variety of electric guitars, predominantly the Rickenbacker 325, Epiphone Casino, and Gibson J160E, and, from the start of his solo career, the Gibson Les Paul Jr. Double Fantasy producer Jack Douglas claimed that since his Beatle days Lennon habitually tuned his D string slightly flat, so his Aunt Mimi could tell which guitar was his on recordings. Occasionally he played a 6-string bass guitar, the Fender Bass Fi, providing bass on some Beatles numbers. Back in the USSR, The Long and Winding Road, Helter Skelter, that occupied McCartney with another instrument. His other instrument of choice was the piano, on which he composed many songs, including Imagine, described as his best-known solo work. His jamming on a piano with McCartney in 1963 led to the creation of the Beatles' first US #1, I Wanna Hold Your Hand. In 1964, he became one of the first British musicians to acquire a Mellotron keyboard, though it was not heard on a Beatles recording until Strawberry Fields Forever in 1967. The British critic Nick Cohn observed of Lennon, he owned one of the best pop voices ever, rasped, and smashed, and brooding, always fierce. Cohn wrote that Lennon, performing Twist and Shout, would rant his way into total incoherence, half-rupture himself. When the Beatles recorded the song, the final track during the Mammoth one-day session that produced the band's 1963 debut album, Please Please Me, Lennon's voice, already compromised by a cold, came close to giving out. Lennon said, "I couldn't sing the damn thing, I was just screaming." In the words of biographer Barry Miles, Lennon simply shredded his vocal cords in the interests of rock and roll. The Beatles' producer, George Martin, tells how Lennon had an inborn dislike of his own voice which I could never understand. He was always saying to me, "Do something with my voice. Put something on it. Make it different." Martin obliged, often using double tracking and other techniques. As his Beatles era segued into his solo career, his singing voice found a widening range of expression. Biographer Chris Gregory writes of Lennon tentatively beginning to expose his insecurities in a number of acoustic-led confessional ballads, so beginning the process of public therapy that will eventually culminate in the primal screams of Cold Turkey, and the cathartic John Lennon/Plastic Ono Band. Music critic Robert Christgau called this Lennon's greatest vocal performance. From Scream to Whine, is modulated electronically, echoed, filtered, and double-tracked. David Stewart Ryan described Lennon's vocal delivery as ranging from extreme vulnerability, sensitivity, and even naivety to a hard rasping style. Wiener too described contrasts, saying the singer's voice can be at first subdued, soon it almost cracks with despair. Music historian Ben Urish recalled hearing the Beatles' Ed Sullivan Show performance of This Boy played on the radio a few days after Lennon's murder, as Lennon's vocals reached their peak. It hurt too much to hear him scream with such anguish and emotion. But it was my emotions I heard in his voice. Just like I always had. Music historians Schinder and Schwartz wrote of the transformation in popular music styles that took place between the 1950s and the 1960s. They said that the Beatles' influence cannot be overstated, having revolutionized the sound, style, and attitude of popular music, and opened rock and roll's doors to a tidal wave of British rock acts, The group then spent the rest of the 1960s expanding rock's stylistic frontiers. On National Poetry Day in 1999, the BBC conducted a poll to identify the UK's favourite song lyric, and announced Imagine as the winner. In 1997, Yoko Ono and the BMI Foundation established an annual music competition program for songwriters of contemporary musical genres to honor John Lennon's memory and his large creative legacy. Over $400,000 have been given through BMI Foundation's John Lennon scholarships to talented young musicians in the United States. In a 2006 Guardian article, John Wiener wrote, "For young people in 1972, it was thrilling to see Lennon's courage in standing up to U.S. President Nixon. That willingness to take risks with his career and his life is one reason why people still admire him today." For music historians Ulrich and Bielin, Lennon's most significant effort was the self-portraits in his songs, which spoke to, for, and about the human condition. In 2013, Downtown Music Publishing signed a publishing administration agreement for the U.S. with Ono Music and Ono Music, home to the song catalogs of John Lennon and Yoko Ono respectively. Under the terms of the agreement, Downtown represents Lennon's solo works, including Imagine, Instant Karma, We All Shine On, Power to the People, Happy Christmas, War is Over, Jealous Sky, Just Like, Starting Over, and others. Lennon continues to be mourned throughout the world, and has been the subject of numerous memorials and tributes. In 2002, the airport in Lennon's hometown was renamed the Liverpool John Lennon Airport. On what would have been Lennon's 70th birthday in 2010, Cynthia and Julian Lennon unveiled the John Lennon Peace Monument in Shavas Park, Liverpool. The sculpture, entitled Peace and Harmony, exhibits peace symbols, and carries the inscription Peace on Earth for the Conservation of Life. Middle died in honor of John Lennon 1940–1980. In December 2013, the International Astronomical Union named one of the craters on Mercury after Lennon. The Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership is regarded as one of the most influential and successful of the 20th century. As performer, writer or co-writer, Lennon had 25 #1 singles in the US Hot 100 chart. His album sales in the US stand at 14 million units. Double Fantasy was his best-selling album, at 3 million shipments in the US. Released shortly before his death, it won the 1981 Grammy Award for Album of the Year. The following year, the Brit Award for Outstanding Contribution to Music was given to Lennon. Participants in a 2002 BBC poll voted him 8th of 100 Greatest Britons. Between 2003 and 2008, Rolling Stone recognized Lennon in several reviews of artists and music, ranking him 5th of 100 Greatest Singers of All Time, and 38th of 100 Greatest Artists of All Time, and his albums John Lennon/Plastic Ono Band and Imagine, 22nd and 76th respectively of Rolling Stone's 500 Greatest Albums of All Time. He was appointed member of the Order of the British Empire, MBE, with the other Beatles in 1965, but returned his medal in 1969 because of Britain's involvement in the Nigeria-Biafra thing, against our support of America and Vietnam, and against cold turkey slipping down the charts. Lennon was posthumously inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame in 1987, and into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1994.